Montana Territory. Clearwater Basin, October 1861. The cold came early that year. Not the kind of cold that arrives with warning, with gray skies building slow over the eastern ridges, with frost collecting first on the low grass before climbing toward the pines. This cold came like a verdict already decided, like something the mountain had been holding back all summer and finally let loose all at once without apology, without transition, the way certain kinds of loss arrive before a man has finished grieving the last one. Caleb Hearn felt it in his hands before he felt it anywhere else. He always did. 34 years of Montana Territory had taught him that much. The cold found the places a man had been broken before, old knuckle injuries, a wrist bent wrong in a forge accident 7 years back, and settled there first patient and certain the way debt settles into a household that cannot pay it. He stood on the barren hillside with one hand resting on Ledger's shoulder. His son, 8 years old. Small for his age, though nobody in Clearwater Crossing said so anymore, not since the boy had stopped flinching when people spoke unkindly about his father. That stillness in a child was harder to look at than tears would have been. It meant the child had already learned something he should not have needed to learn, yet that the world's opinion of you was a weather system you lived inside, not something you could argue with or change by being good enough. Behind them, the narrow wagon trail wound back down toward the valley floor. Ahead of them, carved into the black basalt face of the mountain like something nature had made by accident and then forgotten about, yawned the entrance to a cave. Dark inside, cold-smelling. The kind of place a man rode past without slowing his horse. Beside Caleb stood Aldous Crane, 50 years old, broad through the chest, with a face that had learned long ago how to hold contempt without showing the effort it took. He gripped the reins of his wagon with both hands, even though the horses had stopped moving. Old habit. The habit of a man who needed to feel he was holding something at all times, even when there was nothing left to steer. Behind Aldous in the wagon bed sat Mabel Crane. She kept her eyes on the floorboards. She had been doing that for 3 days now, ever since Aldous had announced what was going to happen, and she had decided, as she often decided in the hard situations that her husband manufactured, that looking away was easier than looking at the consequences of her silence. Aldous spoke without turning his head. "This is the boundary of what was Nora's," he said. "Her folks left it to her. She left it to you, I suppose, since she never had the chance to leave it to anyone else." His voice carried the particular flatness of a man delivering information he had rehearsed into something that sounded like fairness, but was built entirely from the raw material of contempt. The strip of land was barren. Black stone and dry yellow grass, and one narrow seam of earth that might have supported something green in a wetter year. The cave mouth sat at the northern edge of it, dark and low and permanent. Caleb looked at it for a long moment before he answered. "You're sending a child up here before the first heavy snow," he said. His voice did not rise. There was no anger left in it. Only the particular exhaustion of a man who has already spent everything he had on grief and has nothing left over for outrage. He had used his anger up in the months after Nora died on the empty cabin walls, on the cold floor she had described in her last breath on himself, most of all for the 100 things he might have done differently, and hadn't. There was nothing left to direct at Aldous Crane. Aldous turned the wagon without responding. The wheels ground against the loose shale of the trail. Mabel's eyes stayed on the floorboards as the wagon moved away, and Caleb watched it go until the trail curved south and carried it out of sight behind a stand of dead pine. Ledger stood very still beside him. The old hound copper circled the cave entrance once nose low, reading the cold air drifting outward from the darkness. Then the dog sat down at the cave mouth and looked back at the boy, calm as a thing that has already made its decision and is waiting for the people to catch up. Pa Ledger said quietly, "Is this where we're going to live?" Caleb did not answer right away. He looked at the mountain. He looked at the sky above it, heavy and gray-white, the color of old iron before it goes into the forge. Then he picked up the rope coil from the ground where Aldous' wagon hand had dropped their belongings without ceremony, and he walked toward the cave entrance. "Come on," he said. That was all. Caleb had known cold his whole life. He had slept in canvas tents in February when the thermometer at the Clearwater Crossing General Store dropped below what it was built to measure. He had worked forge fires in January wind that came down off the Bitterroot ridges so hard it bent smoke sideways before it cleared the chimney cap. He had held his wife's hand through 2 Montana winters in a timber cabin that seemed to breathe the cold inward, the way lungs breathe air, drawing it through every warped plank and every nail hole, and every place where the chinking had dried and cracked and given up. He knew cold the way a man knows something that has taken everything from him. Nora had known it too. She had felt it differently, though. Where Caleb experienced cold as an opponent, something to fight, to outwork, to keep at bay through sheer stubbornness and another log on the fire, Nora had felt it as a conversation. Something, the landscape was trying to say. She would press her palm flat against the wall of their cabin on winter mornings and hold it there for a long time, reading something in the wood that Caleb couldn't quite hear. "The wood doesn't hold it," she told him once. "It lets it in slow so you don't notice until you're already cold all the way through." That was the winter before the last one. The winter she was still strong enough to have opinions about the cold instead of just suffering through it. The last thing she ever said to him in a voice so quiet he had to lean close to catch the words was this: "The cold comes up through the floor, Caleb. Wood never learns to hold it back." He had thought he understood what she meant. He was wrong about that. He would not understand what she actually meant until the night Aldous Crane said something on this very hillside that changed the shape of every memory Caleb carried. But that came later. The first thing Caleb noticed when he stepped inside the cave was the absence of wind, not warmth, not comfort, simply the absence of movement. Outside, the October air came down off the eastern ridges in thin cold currents that found every gap in a man's collar and every space between boot leather and wool sock. Inside the cave, the air stopped. It sat still and heavy and dry in a way that outdoor air in October in Montana territory had no right to be. Caleb lifted the torch he had lit at the cave mouth and moved it slowly along the eastern wall. The flame bent sideways, then straightened, then bent again, pulled gently toward a narrow crack in the basalt where some deeper movement of air was happening far below the surface of the mountain. He watched the flame for a long time without moving. Then he crouched and pressed his palm flat against the rock floor. Not warm. Nobody would have called it warm. But it was not the cold of a timber floor in October either. It was something steadier than that. Something that did not shift with the wind outside or drop with the temperature after sundown. The stone held whatever temperature it had reached during the last weeks of September and simply kept it indifferent to what the air above it was doing, indifferent to what men needed it to be. Caleb stayed crouched with his hand on the rock for nearly a full minute. Behind him, Ledger sat down against the eastern wall without being told to. Copper moved to the boy's side, circled once on the basalt floor, and lay down. The old dog settled his chin on his front paws and looked toward the cave entrance with calm, heavy eyes. Caleb looked at his son, then at the dog, then back at the rock beneath his hand. For the first time since Nora died, a thought entered his mind that was not about surviving the next week. It was something further out than that. Something that felt cautiously and without any certainty like the early shape of a plan. Stone might hold what timber never could. He didn't say it out loud. He wasn't ready to say it out loud. But he didn't let go of the thought either. The next morning, Caleb rode down into Clearwater Crossing. The town sat at the base of the valley like something the mountains had decided to tolerate. 2 streets wide. A general store, a blacksmith shed, a feed yard, a small Methodist church whose white paint was peeling in long strips from the south-facing wall, a saloon that opened earlier than anyone admitted and closed later than anyone acknowledged. Dorcas Pell ran the general store and by extension a significant portion of the town's winter survival. She was a narrow woman in her late 50s with the kind of face that had decided years ago that pleasantness was a resource to be rationed carefully and deployed strategically. She kept the winter credit ledger behind the counter in a gray cloth book that she wrote in with the unhurried confidence of someone recording facts rather than making decisions, as though the ledger itself were the authority and she merely its instrument. Caleb needed lamp oil and rope and salt. He had labor to trade and nothing else. He pushed the door open and the bell above it rang, and Dorcas Pell looked up from her ledger. And her expression did not change, which was its own kind of change, the specific non-expression of a woman who has prepared herself for this encounter and is executing that preparation. The store had 4 other people in it. A cattleman warming his hands near the iron stove. 2 ranch hands buying tobacco at the far counter. A woman from the south end of the valley picking through bolts of winter cloth. They all found something else to look at when Caleb walked in. Not rudely, not with any dramatic display of avoidance. Just the quiet, practiced redirection of people who have made a social decision and are maintaining it. He set his trade offer on the counter. 3 days of labor wood splitting fence repair, whatever Dorcas needed done before the freeze. For lamp oil, 2 coils of rope and 20 pounds of salt. Dorcas wrote something in her ledger. Then she looked up. "I'll want 4 days," she said. "And the price on oil has changed since last month." Caleb looked at the oil cans behind her on the shelf. The same cans as always. The same supplier's mark on the side. "How much?" he said. She told him. It was nearly double. The cattleman near the stove shifted his boots against the floorboards. One of the ranch hands found something very interesting to examine on the tobacco shelf. The woman at the cloth bolts went very still. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'll take 2 coils of rope and 15 pounds of salt. Oil I'll find elsewhere." Dorcas wrote in her ledger again. Then she set her pen down with a small, deliberate click and looked at him directly for the first time since he had entered. "Mr. Hearn," she said. Her voice was steady and carried easily in the quiet store, pitched for the room rather than for him alone. "I believe it's my obligation to tell you that I have written a letter to the territorial office in Helena." The woman, looking at cloth, stopped moving entirely. "I have reported." Dorcas continued that a widower in this valley is proposing to house an 8-year-old child in a basalt cave through the Montana winter. The territory has provisions regarding the welfare of children in its settlement districts. A man from Helena will be coming to assess the situation before the heavy snow. If he determines that the arrangement is unsuitable, and I expect he will find it unsuitable, the child will be remanded to the territorial orphan home in Missoula. She picked her pen back up. "I thought you should know," she said. She returned her eyes to the ledger as if the matter were already recorded, and therefore already concluded, already a thing that had happened rather than a thing that was happening. Caleb stood at the counter for a long moment. He could feel every person in the store not looking at him. That particular weight of collective attention dressed up as indifference, the specific social pressure of a room full of people who have aligned themselves with one side of a situation and are waiting to see how the other side responds. He had felt it before after Nora died, when the town had made its quiet decision about what kind of man allowed his wife to die of pneumonia in a leaking cabin. He picked up the rope coils from the counter. He counted out the labor credit for the salt. "I'll be back Thursday for the fence work," he said. He walked out without another word. Outside, Ledger was waiting on the wagon seat with Copper beside him. The boy looked at his father's face and asked nothing. He had learned since his mother died to read the space around his father's silences. He could tell the difference between the silence of a man who had nothing to say and the silence of a man who was carrying something too large to put into words, yet something that needed to be walked home with and set down carefully before it could be examined. Caleb climbed up, took the reins, and sat for a moment, looking at the gray sky above the eastern ridges. He had, by his best estimate, 3 weeks before the first heavy snow sealed the upper mountain roads. That was when a man from Helena would most likely arrive before the passes became impassable, while there was still time to conduct an assessment and act on its conclusions. 3 weeks to turn a cave into something that could not be argued with. He clicked the horses forward. That evening, as Caleb was fitting the first timber piece across the cave entrance to block the direct canyon wind, a figure appeared at the base of the trail below. He didn't hear footsteps. He simply looked up, and the man was there, standing at the edge of the clearing in the failing light, watching, old, 70 or close to it, long gray beard that had gone the color of weathered wood. one shoulder sitting noticeably lower than the other, the permanent settlement of an old injury that had healed wrong and stayed wrong. He wore the kind of coat that had been practical once 20 years ago before it became a record of everything the man had done while wearing it. A coat that carried the history of its owner in its patches and its stains and the specific way it hung on a frame that hard decades had whittled down to essentials. He did not come closer. He stood at the tree line and looked at the cave entrance and at the timber piece Caleb was fitting against the stone, and his expression was the careful reading expression of a man trying to determine whether something confirms what he already suspected or contradicts it. Caleb watched him. The old man spoke without raising his voice, but his voice carried through the still evening air with the clarity of someone who has learned that words are worth very little unless they arrive precisely. "That cave still breathing," he said. Caleb frowned. "What do you mean by that?" The man looked at the cave entrance for another moment. His eyes moved to the crack in the eastern basalt, where the torch flame had bent earlier. He looked at it for a long time, the way a man looks at something he recognizes. Then he turned and walked back into the pines without answering. Caleb stood holding the timber piece and staring at the place where the man had been. Ledger appeared at his elbow, having watched the exchange from inside the throat wall. "Who was that?" the boy asked. "I don't know," Caleb said, but he knew something about this place. That much was clear. His name, Caleb would learn the next day from Pastor Oren Falk, was Gable Voss. He had trapped the upper Bitterroot Basin for 30 years before something had driven him off the mountain. Not injury, not age, but something that sat heavier than either of those things and could not be walked off or worked through. He lived now in a low stone shelter north of the basin, mostly alone, emerging occasionally to trade or resupply, but never staying in town longer than the transaction required. He did not make social calls. He did not explain himself, that he had come to look at the cave without being asked, and had asked the one question he asked meant something that Caleb could not yet read. The next 6 days were the hardest physical work of Caleb's life, and Caleb Hearn had worked hard every day of his life since he was 12 years old. He cut lodgepole pine along the lower ridge and hauled the trunks uphill on rope harnesses, one at a time, the weight of each log pulling against his shoulders and spine on the uphill grade until his back spoke to him in a language that was mostly complaint. He dug a drainage trench along the eastern edge of the cave entrance with a pickaxe borrowed against 3 days of future labor, cutting through frozen topsoil into the softer clay beneath, angling the channel away from the cave floor so that meltwater would run out rather than pool inward and spread its cold across the ground where they would sleep. He fitted flat shale slabs above the fire pit in a configuration that would force rising heat to spread horizontally across the ceiling of the chamber before it escaped upward rather than simply venting straight out and taking all the warmth it had generated with it. He packed wet clay from the creek bank into the gaps between the timber throat wall and the basalt rock face, sealing the places where cold air would otherwise find its way through at night. Ledger helped without being asked. He gathered moss and armloads of dried grass from the lower slope for insulation packing. He hauled creek clay in a bucket that was too heavy for him and said nothing about the weight. He learned by careful observation which sections of the basalt wall stayed drier than others after rain, and he brought this information to his father with the serious precision of a person who has understood that information is a form of labor too, that noticing things carefully is not separate from the work, but part of it. Copper moved between them like a slow foreman, checking the work settling in different locations around the chamber and staying until he was satisfied, then moving on to the next position. On the 7th evening, Caleb built the first real fire. It held for 20 minutes. The smoke moved correctly, rising through the throat wall, pulling toward the vent crack in the eastern basalt, behaving exactly as he had designed it to behave. Then the wind shifted. It happened in seconds. One moment the draft was running in the right direction. The next, a pressure change somewhere above the ridge reversed the flow entirely, and black smoke rolled backward through the throat wall into the sleeping chamber in a thick, acrid wave that had no interest in the careful plan it was violating. Ledger woke, coughing, before Caleb could reach him. Copper backed against the far wall, pressing himself against the basalt, as though trying to get beneath the smoke layer. Caleb smothered the fire with dirt in 3 hard movements, throwing his weight against it, killing it fast. For a long time after, while the smoke thinned and the cold settled back in, Caleb sat against the basalt bench in the dark and listened to his son cough and then stop coughing and then breathe slowly toward sleep. The stone around him had gone cold again almost immediately once the fire was out. He sat in the dark for a long time. He thought about Nora, about the way she had pressed her palm against the cabin wall that last winter, reading something in the wood that he had never been able to feel. About the way the fire in that cabin had burned hard every night, while the room stayed cold. Anyway, the heat vanishing somewhere into the warped timber before it could settle into the space where they lived and breathed and tried to stay warm enough to keep going. He thought about what it would mean if the man from Helena arrived and found this a cold cave, a failed fire, a child sleeping in a place that any reasonable official could argue was unfit for a child. He thought about Ledger in a building in Missoula, surrounded by strangers, without his father, without copper, without the particular silence of a Montana mountain at night that was the only world either of them had ever known. He did not sleep. 2 mornings later, Gable Voss appeared again. This time he came all the way to the cave entrance. He stood outside the throat wall in the pale morning light and looked at the construction without touching anything. His eyes moved slowly and with attention. He studied the angle of the drainage trench, the placement of the shale shelf above the fire pit, the timber throat wall, and the direction of its opening relative to the prevailing canyon wind. Then he looked at Caleb. "I know why it failed," he said. Caleb said nothing. He waited. He had learned already that Gable Voss did not respond well to being hurried. "The cave is bleeding heat faster than it can hold it," Gable said. "The problem is not the fire. The problem is that the wet ground beneath your gravel floor is pulling warmth downward faster than the stone walls can return it. And your throat wall is angled wrong by 4 degrees. Not enough to stop the draft when the canyon wind reverses. Just enough to lose." He said this without condescension, simply as information, the way a man reports what he has observed, because the observation is useful and withholding it would be wasteful. Then he said, "I'm not going to build it for you." Caleb looked at him steadily. Gable said, "You understand this mountain better than you think you do. You just haven't learned to ask it the right questions yet." He paused. "The answers are already in what you've built. Look at what the smoke tried to do. Don't look at where it went. Look at what it was trying to do when the pressure changed." He turned and walked back down the trail without elaborating. That afternoon, Caleb pulled up the gravel floor and laid coarse river stones beneath it, larger, denser, better at holding the small amount of natural warmth that rose from the deep earth and conducting it upward into the chamber. He repositioned the throat wall. He added a second shale lining behind the first, creating a thermal buffer between the fire pit and the sleeping area. He lowered the ceiling of the sleeping section with a framework of cedar poles and cured hides, trapping the rising heat at a height where a sleeping person could actually benefit from it, rather than watching it pool uselessly against the high basalt ceiling. He also cut a secondary baffle from flat shale and fitted it into the corner where the throat wall met the eastern basalt face, the corner Gable had not pointed to, but whose weakness Caleb had identified himself by doing what Gable had suggested, by watching what the smoke had been trying to do rather than where it had gone. The baffle would redirect any pressure reversal at that corner back toward the main draft channel rather than allowing it to spread into the chamber and build. He had figured it out himself. That mattered to him more than he expected it to. Ledger watched every adjustment, asking no questions. Just watching. Absorbing the logic of it from the sequence of decisions rather than from any explanation. That evening, Caleb built the second fire. It burned smaller than the first. Steadier. The smoke moved correctly and kept moving correctly for 2 hours, then 4, then through the full night. By 3 in the morning, when Caleb woke from a short sleep and reached toward the basalt bench beside him, the stone was warm. Not hot. Warm in the way a hearthstone is warm hours after the fire that heated it has burned to nothing, a stored warmth, a held warmth. The warmth of something that has absorbed what it was given and kept it rather than letting it escape. Ledger was asleep on the cedar pole shelf above the coldest ground air. He was not coughing. He was not shivering. His breathing was slow and even and completely ordinary, the breathing of a boy who is simply asleep and warm, and not being asked to do anything harder than that. Copper had moved away from the fire pit and was sleeping against the eastern basalt wall. The dog had not done that before. He had always stayed close to the fire. But now the fire was only one source of warmth, and the stone around them had become another steadier one, and the old dog had understood this before Caleb had thought to articulate it. Caleb sat in the firelight for a long time. He was not happy. Happiness felt like a country he had forgotten. The road to a place that existed on old maps, but not in the territory he was currently crossing. But something else was present in the cave that night. Something that felt carefully and without excess, like the first real possibility that this was going to work. That a stone could hold what timber never could. That Nora had been pressing her palm against a cabin wall and feeling the answer to a question she had not yet fully formed. He did not let himself think about it too long. There was still too much to build, and not enough time to build it. But he did not push the thought away either. In the weeks that followed, the town of Clearwater Crossing worked out its position on Caleb Hearn, the way small towns always work out their positions on inconvenient people, not through any single decision or declared policy, but through 100 small daily adjustments that added up to a wall. A wall with no gates and no explaining itself. Dorcas Pell's oil prices stayed doubled. Salt came in smaller quantities than he had paid for. 2 men who had agreed to trade labor for materials suddenly found other obligations. At the feed yard, conversations stopped when Caleb walked in and resumed at a slightly different pitch once he had what he needed and was leaving. None of it was said directly. Frontier towns rarely said difficult things directly. They simply arranged the temperature of a room and let a man feel it. Caleb worked around it the way he worked around everything. He repaired a broken wagon axle behind the blacksmith shed for a cattleman who asked no questions about caves or children. He split 3 cords of firewood for a family south of town who paid in flour and dried beef without discussing why cash was not offered. He traded a morning of fence repair to Winslow Red, a young ranch hand who worked the eastern edge of Crane property, for a bundle of cedar poles and a block of beeswax. Winslow was 23 years old and had the quality of a decent man who had not yet been fully tested. He came up to the cave the following afternoon with genuine curiosity written clearly on a face that had not yet learned to hide what it was feeling. He stood inside the entrance for a long moment after stepping out of the October wind, and his expression shifted in a way he could not control, the involuntary recalibration of a body that expected one thing and received another. The air inside was dry. Still, measurably warmer than the air outside, not dramatically, not enough to seem impossible, but enough for a man's body to register before his mind caught up to it. He pressed his hand against the basalt bench briefly. His eyebrows moved. "That ain't possible," he said quietly. "Not for stone." Caleb was at the eastern wall fitting an iron spike. He said nothing and kept working. Winslow left an hour later. Something had shifted in him during that hour. Caleb could see it in the way the young man walked out slower than he had walked in, with a quality of thought that had not been there before. He did not come back the following week, or the week after. Caleb noticed one afternoon the Crane Ranch feed wagons making a delivery stop at Winslow Red's bunkhouse at the eastern edge of the valley. He watched the wagons from the cave entrance without expression. That night, Ledger sat beside the fading fire and looked at his father. "Does Winslow hate us now?" he asked. Caleb looked at the red coals for a long time. "No," he said. "Winter just makes people afraid." It was the truest thing he knew how to say about what was happening in the valley below them. Fear in a hard country took strange shapes. It looked like doubled prices and shortened conversations and young men who stopped coming around. It rarely announced itself honestly. It just arranged things so that the people who might cause you trouble were a little farther away and then a little farther until the distance felt like the natural state of things. Ledger nodded slowly, filing the information carefully. 3 days after that conversation, Aldous Crane came up the mountain. He came alone on horseback with the rifle across his saddle that Caleb understood was habit as much as intent. A man like Aldous Crane carried a rifle the way other men carried their posture, not because he expected to use it, but because it said something about who he believed himself to be and what kind of man he required the world to see when it looked at him. Caleb was outside the cave entrance splitting cedar when Aldous rode into the clearing. He did not stop working. He split 2 more pieces and stacked them under the canvas cover before he straightened and looked at the man. Aldous sat on the horse for a moment. Then he dismounted and tied the reins to a lodgepole sapling and walked toward the cave entrance with the particular stride of a man who is going somewhere he has already decided he has the right to go. He said he'd come to check on Ledger. Caleb stepped aside and let him in. Aldous stood just inside the throat wall. He did not move further in at first. He stood and looked at the chamber with the expression of a man who has prepared himself to see one thing and is confronted with something that does not match that preparation. The drying line, the layered shale above the fire pit, the river stones laid into the floor, the basalt bench along the eastern wall, Ledger sitting cross-legged on the cedar shelf eating from a tin bowl, watching the visitor with the calm watchfulness of a child who has learned to withhold reaction until a situation has shown him what it is. Aldous walked slowly through the chamber without speaking. He stopped at the basalt bench. He reached out and rested one rough hand against the stone. He held it there. The bench had been absorbing heat from small controlled fires for 3 days straight. Not hot. Never hot. But warm in a way that a stone wall in October in Montana Territory had no right to be a warmth that came from accumulated patient heat rather than from any current source. Aldous pulled his hand away. He looked at Ledger. "How you eating?" he said to the boy. Ledger looked at him steadily. "Fine," he said. One word, delivered without hostility and without warmth. Aldous looked around the chamber one more time. Something moved in his face, not remorse, not yet, but something more preliminary than remorse. The first crack in a version of events he had been maintaining for a long time, too long for the crack to be comfortable. He turned toward the cave entrance. Caleb followed him out. They stood in the cold outside air, and Aldous looked out over the clearing toward the valley below. The wind came down off the eastern ridge and moved through the dry grass with a sound like running water, cold and directionless. Then Aldous said something. He said it quietly without the carrying quality of his earlier pronouncements. His voice had a different texture now, the texture of something set down rather than delivered. Something that had been carried a long time and was finding its way to the ground in the wrong place because there was nowhere better to put it. Nora used to say he said that basalt holds heat like cast iron. She said it the winter before she died. He stopped. I told her she was wrong, he said. He did not say anything after that. He untied his horse and mounted and rode back down the trail toward the valley without looking back. Caleb stood outside the cave entrance for a long time after the sound of hoofbeats faded. Nora had said it. Nora had known. She had pressed her palm against those timber walls and felt them bleed warmth and thought about what held heat better. And she had named it basalt. And her brother had told her she was wrong, and then she had died in a room that could not hold its heat. And her last words to Caleb had been about the floor. The cold comes up through the floor. Wood never learns to hold it back. She had not been saying goodbye. She had been trying to finish a thought she had started the winter before the thought Aldous had dismissed on a day Caleb had not been present for, on a day whose consequences had settled into Nora quietly and stayed there. She had been trying in her last breath to give him the answer she had worked out. She had been right all along. Caleb stood on the hillside with the wind moving through the grass below him, and this knowledge moving through him, the way heat moves through basalt, slowly and deeply, and once it is there, not going anywhere. He went back inside. He checked the fire. He checked the secondary baffle at the throat wall corner. He pressed his palm against the stone bench and felt the warmth there, patient and steady and real. Then he started working on the next problem, because that was what there was. That was all there had ever been. The next problem waiting to be understood. The next piece to be fitted. The next thing to be held in place against whatever was coming. Pastor Orrin Falk brought flour and lamp oil 2 evenings later and sat for a few minutes on the upturned log near the fire pit, which was the closest thing to a social call the cave had received since Aldous Crane's visit. Falk was a lean man in his late 40s, with a quality of stillness that was different from Caleb's stillness, where Caleb's silence was the silence of a man managing grief. Falk's was the silence of a man who had learned to observe carefully before speaking. He had been watching the situation in Clearwater Crossing since Aldous Crane had driven Caleb up the mountain trail in early October, and he had said nothing publicly, which in a town that size was itself a kind of position. He looked at the basalt bench, at the drying line, at Ledger asleep on the cedar shelf with copper pressed against his side. Then he looked at Caleb. "The man Dorcas Pell wrote to," he said quietly, "has been assigned. He'll arrive before the first heavy snow to assess the child's living situation." Caleb waited. Falk said, "You have perhaps 3 weeks, maybe less." Caleb looked at his son sleeping on the cedar shelf, warm for the first time in months, breathing in the slow, easy rhythm of a child who is not cold. "I'll be ready," he said. He wasn't certain that was true, but he said it the way a man says things he needs to believe in order to keep doing what the work requires. Falk stood and pulled his coat straight and turned toward the entrance. He paused. "One more thing," he said. "Aldous Crane came to see me last week. He asked whether I thought the cave was safe." Caleb said nothing. "I told him I hadn't seen it yet," Falk said. He looked back at the chamber, at the warm bench, at the dry clothes on the line, at the sleeping boy. "Now I have." He stepped out into the cold mountain night. The sky above Clearwater Basin was building towards something. The clouds coming in off the divide were lower than they had been last week. The deer had moved off the upper tree line 3 days ago. Copper slept closer to the eastern vent each night, nose pointed toward whatever the mountain was moving through the deep rock, listening to things that had not yet arrived. Caleb watched all of it. He banked his fires carefully. He checked his drainage trench. He reinforced the throat wall brace. He made sure the shale shelf was seated correctly above the fire pit and that the secondary baffle sat flush against the corner joint. He was not ready. He was not sure he would ever feel ready, but he was closer than he had been the day Aldous Crane had handed him a strip of barren hillside and a hole in the rock and called it an inheritance. He was closer than anyone in Clearwater Crossing believed. And somewhere below the basin, the mountain was beginning to breathe in the long, slow way it breathed before a serious storm, pulling air down from the divide in deep, cold currents that the deer and the dogs and the men who had lived long enough to read such things could feel before anyone else. Winter was coming. Caleb Hearn was not going to let it win. Montana Territory. Clearwater Basin. November 1861. November arrived the way it always arrived in the upper basin, not as a single cold morning, but as a slow erasure. The color went first. The yellow grass on the lower slopes turned gray, then brown, then disappeared under the first thin skims of snow that melted by midday, but left the ground harder each time. Then the light went, the sky dropping lower each week until it sat on the ridge tops like a lid pressed down over the valley, compressing the daylight into a shorter and shorter corridor between one darkness and the next, until a man working outside found himself starting later and stopping earlier without having made any decision to do so. By the first week of November, Caleb Hearn was waking before 4 in the morning and working until he could no longer see his hands. The system inside the cave had held through 3 weeks of cold October nights. The basalt bench radiated warmth for hours after the evening fire burned down 2 coals. The drainage trench kept the floor dry. The throat wall directed smoke correctly on most nights in most winds. But Caleb knew with the specific knowledge of a man who has built something with his own hands that what worked in October would be tested differently in November and tested differently again in December, and that each month would find the places he had not thought carefully enough about and press against them until something gave, so he kept building. He added a second tier of river stones behind the basalt bench, stacking them in a configuration that increased the thermal mass without reducing the airflow between the bench and the eastern wall. He packed additional clay into the gaps between the timber throat wall and the stone face, working by torchlight on the evenings when the temperature dropped fast enough to make the clay stiffen in his hands before he could press it fully into place. He hung cured hides across the rear of the sleeping area to create a smaller enclosed space where Ledger's body heat could accumulate through the night without being absorbed into the larger, cold volume of the back chamber. Ledger watched all of it with the focused attention he had been developing since October. The boy had learned something about the cave that Caleb had not taught him directly, that it was a system, not a shelter, and that a system required understanding rather than just use. He knew which sections of the eastern wall dried fastest after rain and which stayed damp long into the afternoon. He knew the sound the draft made through the vent crack when the airflow was correct, a low, steady movement that was almost below, hearing a sound you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. And he knew the slightly higher, thinner sound it made when ice was beginning to build somewhere above them in the shaft, and the opening was narrowing. That second sound was the one that mattered. That was the one to wake his father for. Copper had settled into the cave the way old dogs settle into places they have decided to trust fully and without reservation, reorganizing his habits around the new geography with a completeness that younger animals rarely managed. He slept against the eastern wall most nights now, away from the fire pressed against the basalt that had absorbed a full day of warmth from small controlled fires and was giving it back slowly and steadily through the hours of darkness. Sometimes Caleb would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning and look at the dog lying against that warm stone, and the sight of it, an animal's uncomplicated trust in something Caleb had built, steadied something in him that needed steadying. Winslow Red came back once more in the first week of November. He arrived in the late afternoon with a bundle of split cedar tied across his horse and an expression that said he had been arguing with himself about whether to come and had not entirely resolved the argument. He carried the cedar inside without being asked, and stacked it against the rear wall and stood for a moment in the warmth of the chamber. He sat down on the basalt bench. He sat there without speaking, feeling the stone through his coat. His mouth moved slightly as though he were doing arithmetic that refused to come out even. "How long does it hold?" he finally asked. Caleb was working on the hide curtain at the rear of the sleeping area. 4 hours, he said. Sometimes 5 if the day's fires have been running since morning. Winslow was quiet. Then he said, "I heard Dorcas Pell talking to 2 men from the valley last week. She said the territorial man is coming before the month is out." Caleb kept working. "What's his name?" he said. Winslow looked at his boots. "I don't know. She said he works out of Helena. She's been in correspondence with him since September." Since September. Caleb thought about that. 2 months of letters before a single snowfall, before anyone had seen how the cave would perform. The decision about what to find had been made before anyone came to find it. "Thank you for the cedar," Caleb said. Winslow stood and pulled his coat straight. He started for the entrance. Then he stopped. "The bench," he said. He did not turn around. He seemed to be looking at the throat wall, at the construction of it, at the stone he had sat on for 20 minutes with the warmth of it coming up through his coat. That bench being warm like that. He stopped again, searching for the right words and not quite finding them. "That's not nothing," he said finally. "Whatever else happens, that's not nothing." He left. Caleb did not see Winslow Red again for 6 weeks. The Crane Ranch feed wagons made their deliveries. The season arranged its loyalties. Winter credit decided things that individual decency could not always override, and Caleb understood that without bitterness, or tried to. Bitterness was a weight he could not afford while he was hauling lodgepole pine uphill on a rope harness. It was Gable Voss who came up the mountain next 7 days into November, carrying a rawhide satchel and a length of burned pine he used for reading smoke behavior. A tool he had made himself from some specific piece of knowledge about how burned wood moved in draft currents that Caleb did not ask about. He did not knock. He did not call out. He simply appeared at the throat wall entrance one morning while Caleb was fitting the second iron spike into the eastern wall, and he stood there and watched for a while. "The drainage is better," he said finally. He looked at the river stones in the floor. "You fixed the thermal bleed." Caleb climbed down. "Mostly," he said. Gable walked the perimeter of the chamber slowly with that patient reading attention. He stopped at the throat wall and examined the angle of it. He crouched and held his burned pine stick near the base of the wall and watched the trace of smoke from it checking the draft at floor level. He looked at the secondary baffle in the corner. He did not comment on the baffle, but something in his posture changed when he saw it a slight settling, a small release of something he had been holding. "You have a remaining weak point," he said. He pointed to the upper section of the vent shaft, where it angled through the softer shale above the main basalt face. "When the canyon wind comes from the northeast and the pressure drops fast, ice will build here first. The shaft will narrow, the draft will compress. If it compresses past a certain point, the pressure in the chamber will equalize and the throat wall will lose its directional control." He looked at Caleb. "You already know what that means." Caleb looked at the vent shaft. "It means the smoke reverses," he said. Gable nodded once. "Fast enough that you won't smell it until it's already a problem." He paused. "Smoke doesn't kill fast. That's what makes it dangerous. It lets a man sleep. It's warm in the chamber and the fire is low and everything seems right, and a man goes to sleep and keeps sleeping because there's nothing to wake him. No cold, no discomfort, just warmth and sleep. And then nothing." He said this with a flatness that was not indifference. It was the flatness of something said, many times rehearsed, until the emotion had worn off the surface of it, leaving only the fact underneath. Caleb sat down on the upturned log near the fire pit. "How do you know so much about this particular kind of cave?" he asked. Gable looked at the fire for a long time before answering. "My father built something like this," he said. His voice had changed, lost the instructional quality it carried when he was talking about airflow and thermal mass, and become something older and quieter. On the north face of the divide in the winter of 1849. He was a trapper who lost his cabin to a fire and had to live through the winter in what the mountain offered him. He figured most of it out himself. The thermal mass, the drainage, how to read what the mountain was doing with the air inside it. He was a practical man who understood that complaining about what you didn't have was a waste of time you needed for solving problems. Caleb said nothing. He waited. "He died in the spring of that year," Gable said. "Different kind of accident. Had nothing to do with the cave." He paused. "I went back to that cave in 1857 to see if I could rebuild what he had built." He stopped. His hands folded on his knees tightened slightly. "I had my grandson with me, 14 years old, a serious boy, the kind of boy who was already thinking about how things worked before anyone had asked him to." The fire moved between them. "I built the cave too tight," Gable said. "Sealed it better than my father had." The heat was remarkable. It held all night without the fire burning hard. He stopped again. His voice went quieter. It held the smoke just as well. "I didn't realize what was happening until the boy had already been breathing bad air for too long. The draft I thought I understood had reversed sometime before midnight. I was asleep. There was nothing to wake me. The cave was warm. Everything felt right." A log shifted in the fire pit, a small sound in the quiet chamber. "He didn't wake up," Gable said. Caleb looked at the vent shaft, at the basalt bench, at Ledger's bedroll on the cedar shelf. "That's why you came up here," he said. "The first evening." Gable looked at the fire. "Partly," he said. He didn't elaborate. He left an hour later. He walked back down the mountain trail in the thin November light and left Caleb with what he had given him, not a lesson about caves, but something older and heavier. The knowledge that wisdom bought through catastrophe has a specific weight to it, and that a man who carries that weight and chooses to share it anyway is performing a kind of generosity that costs something real and deserves to be received with the seriousness that cost implies. Caleb checked the vent shaft that afternoon with the kind of attention he had not given it before. He ran his hand along the full length of the shale section, where it angled through to the outside, feeling for the places where the stone was thinner, where ice would build fastest when the northeast wind came. He found 3 such places. He packed them with a clay and gravel mixture that would give ice less surface to bond to, then covered the exterior of the vent opening with a small angled shelter of flat shale that would redirect the direct force of the wind away from the opening without restricting the draft. He could not eliminate the risk. Gable had not said it could be eliminated, but he could reduce it, and he could make sure that Ledger's job listening to the pitch of the draft and knowing when it changed was easier. A narrowing vent changed pitch gradually. If the boy was listening, they would have warning. He told Ledger what to listen for. The boy listened to the explanation with his full attention, then went to the vent crack and listened to it for 20 minutes, memorizing the current sound. He came back and said, "It's lower than I thought, like wind through a hollow log." "That's right," Caleb said, "and when it narrows, it gets higher. Thinner." "Yes." Ledger nodded once and went back to his tasks. He did not need to be told twice about things that mattered. The vent found them 2 weeks later. It found them on a night in the 3rd week of November, when Ledger was asleep on the cedar shelf and copper was pressed against the eastern wall, and the fire had burned to a bed of clean red coals that were doing their slow work of warming the basalt bench for the night ahead. Caleb was asleep himself, not hovering at the shallow edge of consciousness the way he usually managed, but genuinely asleep, pulled down into it by the accumulated debt of too many short nights and too many early mornings. Ledger heard it first. Not the wind, he had learned to sleep through wind. What woke him was the absence of the sound he had memorized. The low, steady pull of air through the eastern vent that had become as familiar to him as his own breathing had changed. Thinned, gone to that higher pitch. He was across the cave floor and had his hand on his father's shoulder before Caleb's eyes were fully open. Pa Ledger said, "The vent." Caleb was upright before the sentence finished. He registered the smell at the same moment. Not the clean smell of a controlled fire. The heavier, wetter smell of smoke moving where it was not supposed to move. He looked at the throat wall and saw it a thin, dark curl rolling backward through the lower left section of the wall, slow and almost gentle the way something dangerous moves when it does not need to hurry. "Get to the entrance passage," Caleb said. "Take copper. Stay outside the smoke layer." He pulled his scarf up over his mouth and nose and grabbed the iron pry bar from beside the firewood stack. He crouched below the smoke layer, moving fast toward the fire pit, smothering the fire with dirt before it could feed more smoke into the reversing draft. Then he pushed through the outer timber barrier into the night. The cold hit him with a force that was not entirely the cold's fault. It was also the contrast, the sudden total exchange of warm cave air for what the mountain had been holding outside. The wind was from the northeast, hard and dry and carrying ice crystals that moved horizontally, not falling but driven, cutting the exposed skin around his eyes and forehead. He moved along the basalt face toward the vent opening by a touch, one hand on the rock leaning into the stone. The vent opening was choked with wind-packed ice. Not old ice fresh built in the last hour by the direct force of the northeast wind pressing crystals into the shaft faster than the draft could push them back out. He set the pry bar against the ice and pushed. The bar slipped. He grabbed for it and missed. He heard it clatter down the basalt face and then silence as it cleared the edge of the rock shelf and dropped into the ravine below. He stood on the icy basalt, with one hand against the cold rock and the vent opening blocked beside him and the pry bar gone and the wind driving ice into his face. He had no tool. He pressed the fingers of his right hand into the edge of the ice blockage and pulled. The ice was packed tight, bonded to the basalt. It did not give. He pulled harder, feeling the skin on his fingertips compressing against ice edges, and the cold moved through his fingers with a speed that was almost clinical, not gradual, not warning him, just arriving. He found a seam in the ice pack, a place where two deposits had met, but not fully bonded. He drove his fingers in and pulled sideways, and the ice cracked a short, sharp sound under the wind, and a section broke loose. Air moved through the vent, not enough, but present. He could feel it against the skin of his wrist. He kept going. His hands stopped hurting after a few minutes. That was not a good sign, and he knew it, but stopping was not available to him while Ledger was inside. He worked through the numbness by memory. His hands knew what they were doing even when they could not feel it. He found the next seam and pulled, and another section gave way. One more. He found the edge and pulled with both hands, his boots sliding on the icy basalt, one foot going off the shelf edge before he shifted his weight back, and the ice cracked and broke all at once, and the vent opened fully, and the draft surged upward through the shaft, with a sound like a sharp inhalation, the mountain breathing correctly again. He made his way back to the outer timber barrier and pushed through it into the throat wall passage. Ledger was there just inside the entrance, sitting on the ground with copper pressed against him. The boy had not gone outside. He had stayed in the passage where the smoke could not reach him and waited, which was exactly the right decision. A decision that required the specific kind of discipline that was harder for an 8-year-old than for most adults. He looked at his father's hands without speaking. Then he got up and went to the fire pit and rebuilt the fire from the coals while Caleb pressed his hands against the warming basalt bench. Neither of them said anything for a while. The smoke was gone. The draft moved correctly through the vent in its low, familiar pull. Caleb sat on the floor with his back against the bench and his damaged hands against the warm stone and listened to the wind above the ridge. Ledger brought him a tin cup of heated water and sat down beside him. After a long time, Ledger said quietly, "I heard the sound change before you woke up." Caleb looked at his son. "Why didn't you wake me sooner?" he said. Ledger looked at the fire. "I wanted to be sure first," he said. "I didn't want to wake you for nothing." Caleb looked at the boy beside him, 8 years old, sitting on a basalt floor in the middle of a Montana November night, having just made a judgment call that had gone correctly, having sat in the throat wall passage with the smoke smell coming from the chamber and waited with copper and not panicked. "You did right," Caleb said. Ledger nodded. He pressed his shoulder against his father's arm, and they sat together in the firelight and listened to the cave breathe. 4 days after the vent crisis, Aldous Crane came up the mountain for the second time. He came alone again and again without the rifle. He arrived in the late afternoon in the thin gray light that preceded a front moving in off the divide, and he tied his horse and came to the cave entrance without announcing himself. Caleb was inside fitting a new iron bracket, a replacement for the one lost in the ravine when the pry bar went down. He looked up when Aldous appeared at the throat wall. Aldous looked at the bracket. He looked at the basalt bench. He looked at Ledger on the cedar shelf and copper against the wall. Then he said, "Mabel has been sick since the wind came in last week." Caleb kept working. "The ranch house doesn't hold," Aldous said. He said it with the specific difficulty of a man admitting something that costs him more than the words suggest. "I've had the fires running all day, and the cold still comes through the north wall by evening." Caleb looked at him. Aldous's face was doing something complicated. The face of a man whose maintained version of events, the version in which Caleb Hearn was the failure and Aldous Crane was the man who had seen it clearly, was beginning to give way under the weight of what he was currently standing in. The warmth of the cave, the dry air, the unfrozen water in the bucket, the sleeping boy who was not coughing. "I told Nora that basalt was foolish," Aldous said. He said this slowly, as though the words were heavier than they looked and needed to be set down carefully. "The winter she was dying. She wanted me to give you material from the Crane store, cedar and tin sheeting, for the roof on your cabin." Caleb went very still. "I had the material," Aldous said. He looked at the cave wall instead of at Caleb. "We were in a dispute about the eastern pasture boundary, and I was angry, and I told her no." The fire moved between them. "I knew the roof was bad," Aldous said. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the flatness it usually carried down to something more exposed underneath. "I knew what a bad roof meant in this basin through the winter." He stopped. "I told myself it wasn't my obligation to fix a man's roof for him." The sound of the wind above the ridge was the only thing in the cave for a long moment. She died in February, Caleb said. His voice was very level. I know, Aldous said. The cave held the silence between them. The fire held its small, controlled warmth. The basalt bench radiated what it had stored, steady and patient, indifferent to the things men said to each other. Caleb stood up from the bracket fitting. He went to the supply stack at the rear of the cave. He picked up a full can of lamp oil, his last spare, and carried it back to the entrance and held it out. For Mabel, he said. Keep her warm tonight. Aldous looked at the oil can. Then he reached out and took it. His hand was steady, but something around his eyes was not. He turned and walked to the cave entrance. He stopped there. He looked at the throat wall construction, at the careful fitting of timber to stone at the secondary baffle in the corner, at the evidence of the weeks of thinking and labor and failure and correction that had gone into making this place what it was. The cave you built, he said. He seemed to be trying to finish a sentence and finding that the words for it did not exist in the language he usually used. He was a man who had spoken in certainties his entire life and was standing at the edge of something that certainty had no purchase on. He walked out into the cold afternoon. Caleb stood in the cave entrance and watched him ride down the trail. He thought about Nora pressing her palm against the timber walls of that cabin, feeling the cold coming through, knowing what the winter was going to do, asking her brother for help and being refused, carrying that through the weeks that followed as she got sicker and the cold kept coming through the roof and the floor kept pulling the warmth downward. She had been right. She had been right and dismissed, and she had died in the room and her rightness could have saved her from. And her last words had been the thought that outlasted everything else, the thought that wood never holds it, and there is something that holds it better. And here finally is the answer. Caleb stood in the cold for a while longer. Then he went back inside. Pastor Orrin Falk arrived the following evening with a canvas sack containing flour-dried beans and salt pork, and with information that he set down alongside the provisions without ceremony. I've been through the territorial records, he said, that came through the county relay last month. He sat on the upturned log and looked at Caleb directly. The procedure for a child welfare assessment requires a supporting complaint to carry the witnessed signatures of 2 local residents in good standing. He paused. The letter Dorcas Pell sent carries her signature and the signature of 1 other person. 1. The requirement under the 1859 Territorial Settlement Act is 2. Caleb looked at him. A complaint with 1 signature cannot compel a removal order, Falk said. It can compel an inspection, but the inspector cannot act on it without either finding immediate and observable danger to the child or obtaining that second signature while present in the county. Caleb thought about this carefully. She'll find a second signature, he said. Perhaps Falk said. He looked at the cave. Or perhaps the inspector will arrive and conduct his observation before she has the opportunity. He paused. Whatever this inspector expects to find when he walks through that entrance, it is not going to be what he finds. He picked up his coat from the floor. Gable Voss told me something last week, he said. He looked at Caleb. He said, you have already figured out everything that matters about this cave. He said the rest is just endurance. He left. Caleb stood alone in the warmth of the cave. Outside, the wind had shifted again. The sound it made moving through the upper vent was lower than it had been, a deeper, slower movement of air that Caleb had learned over these weeks to associate with a particular quality of weather. Not the sharp, fast wind of a passing front. Something settling in. Something that intended to stay. He pressed his palm against the basalt bench. He checked the throat wall. He checked the corner baffle. Then he went to the cave entrance and stood looking out over Clearwater Basin. The valley below was dark and quiet under the low clouds. The settlement was small and distant, its lights barely visible through the falling dark. The Crane Ranch sat somewhere in that darkness below him, invisible from here, a building that could not hold its warmth through the night. To the north above the divide, the clouds had a particular weight to them that Caleb had seen before, a particular stillness in the air between the cave and those clouds. He had lived in Montana Territory his entire life. He knew what that stillness meant. He went back inside and began making preparations he had hoped to have another week to complete. He hauled every remaining river stone he had collected into the chamber and stacked them in a second tier behind the basalt bench. He filled every bucket and pot and tin vessel he owned with water from the creek below, making 2 trips before the light failed completely, knowing that the creek would be locked under deep ice within days. He reinforced the outer timber brace at the throat wall entrance with a diagonal cross member he had been saving, driving the mounting spikes with a hand sledge until they were seated fully in the basalt face. He packed snow. The thin, early snow accumulated in the shaded sections of the upper slope tightly against the outer wall of the cave entrance building, a crude insulating layer over the exposed timber where the canyon wind struck hardest. Rough, temporary. But a margin he did not have before. Ledger watched all of it without asking why the pace had changed. He was 8 years old, and he had learned over the course of this autumn to read the difference between his father working and his father preparing for something that working alone would not be enough to meet. He pulled his worn boots from the edge of the sleeping shelf where they had been drying and tucked them carefully under the basalt bench where they would stay warm through whatever came. He did not mention that the left sole had nearly separated. He had not mentioned it for 2 weeks. Caleb had noticed. Neither of them said anything about it. There were larger things that had to hold first. That night, the last night before the storm arrived, the cave held perfectly. The draft moved through the vent in its low, steady flow. The basalt bench radiated warmth until nearly 4 in the morning. Ledger slept without stirring deeply and completely in the way children sleep when they feel genuinely safe. Copper lifted his head once sometime in the middle of the night and looked toward the vent shaft with his ears up. Then he set his chin back on his paws and closed his eyes. Caleb lay on his bedroll and looked at the firelight moving on the basalt ceiling and thought about nothing in particular. Not about the man from Helena. Not about Aldous Crane and what he had admitted. Not about Nora, not tonight. He thought about the stone above him. About the mountain that this cave was carved into, sitting above this valley longer than there had been people to name it, holding its temperature independent of whatever the air above it decided to do. Indifferent to weather, indifferent to seasons, holding what it held because that was the nature of stone, not because it was trying to. He pressed his palm flat against the basalt wall beside him. Warm. Still warm. Patient and certain and warm in the complete dark of a Montana November night. Outside north of the divide, the storm that would bury Clearwater Basin under 8 feet of snow was 3 hours away. Montana territory. Clearwater Basin, November 1861. Ledger heard it first. Not the wind. He had learned to sleep through wind over the weeks of October and November, had catalogued its different voices and sorted them into the ones that required attention and the ones that did not. What woke him was the absence of a sound, the low, steady pull of air through the eastern vent shaft that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat had gone silent, replaced by nothing which was worse than any sound the wind could make. He lay still for a moment, making certain. Then he crossed the cave floor in the dark, moving around the fire pit by memory, and put his hand on his father's shoulder. "Pa," he said, "something's wrong outside." Caleb was upright before the sentence finished. He did not smell smoke yet. That was the first thing he checked. The air in the chamber was clean. Whatever was happening had not yet reversed the draft, but the vent sound was gone entirely. Not the thinning that preceded ice buildup, not the higher pitch Ledger had memorized as the warning, but silence which meant the shaft had sealed. He pulled on his coat and wound the scarf around his face and pushed through the outer barrier. The storm had arrived. It had not announced itself. It had simply replaced the world. One moment the mountain had stood in the pressurized stillness of the preceding evening. The next, the darkness outside the cave entrance had turned white. Not with falling snow, but with moving snow. Horizontal. Snow driven sideways by wind that had come off the divide with a force that was not weather in any ordinary sense, but something more elemental. Something that had been compressed in the high mountain cold for weeks and had finally found its release all at once. The wind drove the snow against the basalt face with a sound like thrown gravel. It hit the outer throat wall with a physical impact that Caleb could feel through the stone. The canyon below the cave had disappeared entirely. The valley was gone. The world had reduced itself to a white roaring that had no edges and no center and no interest in anything a man needed. He worked his way along the basalt face toward the vent opening by both hands on the rock, leaning his full weight against the stone to keep the wind from pulling him off the narrow shelf. The cold was absolute, not the cold of a bad Montana night, but the cold of the high divide storms that came every few years, the ones that old men talked about by year rather than by season. The vent opening was completely sealed. Wind-driven snow had packed into it with the density of something that had been compressing for hours rather than minutes, layer on layer, the storm having apparently been working on this particular problem since before anyone inside the cave had noticed. He had no pry bar. He had lost it in the last event. He had not yet replaced it. He used his hands. He worked from the outside edge of the blockage, inward, pulling compacted snow in chunks and throwing it sideways into the storm, where it vanished before it traveled a foot. His hands went through their sequence cold, then pain, then numbness, then that place beyond numbness, where they continued working by instruction because feeling was no longer available to them. The draft began when the blockage was half cleared. A faint pulse against his wrist. He kept going. When the last section broke loose, the draft surged upward with a force that was almost audible, the mountain breathing incorrectly after being held. He made his way back. Inside, Ledger had the fire rebuilt from the coals. Small and steady, exactly right. He had not been told how to manage a fire in a smoke reversal situation. He had learned it by watching his father do it and by understanding why each decision was made. He stood beside the fire pit with the cedar piece in his hand and looked at his father's hands when Caleb came through the entrance. Caleb pressed them against the basalt bench. The stone warmth moved into his fingers in the slow, patient way that warmth always moved into cold things, doing the work at the speed the work required, and no faster. The storm settled in. It did not moderate. It did not cycle through and pass. It came down off the divide and found the basin and sat in it, the way a heavy thing sits when it has found the place it intends to remain, and it proceeded to demonstrate the full extent of what a Montana Territory winter storm could do when it was not constrained by any other consideration. For 3 days, Caleb Hearn did not sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. Every 3 or 4 hours, the vent shaft sealed again. The storm drove snow into it with a persistence that seemed purposeful, as though the weather understood exactly what the shaft was for, and was specifically dedicated to stopping it. Each time the draft narrowed or went silent, Caleb felt it, or Ledger did, or Copper did. And Caleb went out into the storm and cleared the shaft with his hands and came back in and stood against the basalt bench until his fingers worked again. Ledger slept in shifts. The boy had established his own rhythm without being instructed. 4 hours of sleep, 2 hours awake, with his head tilted toward the vent shaft cataloging sounds. When the pitch changed, he woke Caleb. When it held steady, he let his father sleep. He performed this duty with the seriousness of a person who has understood that the task matters and that understanding is the same thing as accepting responsibility for it. Copper moved between the vent shaft and the boy with the regularity of a creature that has accepted a job and is doing it. On the second night of the storm, when the wind shifted unexpectedly and the draft reversed for 40 seconds before the pressure equalized, it was Copper who growled before either of them had registered the change in air quality. The growl woke Ledger. Ledger woke Caleb. Caleb cleared the vent before the smoke had built to anything serious. The fire stayed small throughout, always small. This was the lesson the preceding weeks had taught in a way that Caleb now understood completely and without reservation. The instinct in a bad storm was to build the fire large, to fight the cold with more heat, to compensate for what the storm was taking by adding more of what it was taking. That instinct was wrong. A large fire produced more smoke than the draft could handle, and in a storm constantly threatening to reverse the draft, more smoke meant more danger. A small fire managed carefully produced what it produced and no more, and the basalt absorbed it and stored it and gave it back through the night in a flow that was steady and manageable and safe. The cave did not beat the storm. Caleb understood that now with a clarity that had no room for illusion. The cave simply refused to lose. That was different from winning. That was the thing he had been building toward since October. Not a place stronger than the weather, but a place that had found a different relationship with it. A place that worked with the mountain's rules rather than against them. On the second day of the storm, during one of the quiet intervals between vent-clearing trips, Ledger sat beside the fire with his back against the basalt bench and looked at his father. "The bench is warmer this morning than it was yesterday morning," he said. Caleb looked at it. "It's been absorbing for 2 days straight," he said. "The more mass it holds, the longer it takes to cool." Ledger thought about this. "Like a cast-iron pan," he said. "The heavier it is, the longer it holds what you put into it." Caleb looked at his son, 8 years old, working out thermal mass from first principles by analogy. "That's right," he said. Ledger was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She already knew, didn't she?" Caleb looked at the bench. "Yes," he said. "She already knew." Ledger pressed his small hand flat against the warm stone beside him. He held it there and looked at it, this hand against this stone, this warmth that should not exist by any reasonable expectation, this thing that his mother had named in a conversation with a man who had dismissed it, and in a last breath that had been trying to finish the thought. "She told you," Ledger said. "At the end. She told me," Caleb said. They sat together in the warmth of the cave, while the storm tried its various approaches on the mountain outside, and the mountain refused each one. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm loosened. Not stopped, not finished, but the character of it changed. The violence left it. The horizontal force of the wind dropped until snow was actually falling rather than attacking, and the roaring in the canyon below the cave fell to a lower, exhausted register. Caleb stepped outside and stood in the changed air. The upper Bitterroot Basin had vanished under snow. Drifts stood chest-deep across the lower slopes. The pine trees along the tree line were bent under accumulated weight. The trail down to the valley was a faint depression in a white plain that stretched to the base of the ridges. He looked south toward Crane Ranch. No smoke. He stood looking for a long time. He thought about Mabel Crane, sick before the storm. He thought about Aldous, who had come up the mountain with lamp oil in his hand and admitted things that cost him real money of the self, and who had ridden back down to a house that could not hold its warmth on a normal November night. He thought about what 3 days of deep cold and 8 feet of snow did to a ranch house whose north wall let the cold through by evening. He went back inside. Ledger was awake, sitting with Copper's head in his lap. He held out the last pair of dry wool gloves without saying anything. Just held them out. Caleb took them. It took nearly 2 hours to reach Crane Ranch. The snow in the valley was deep, and in the places where the canyon wind had stacked it against fences and outbuildings, it reached past his waist. He used the mattock ahead of each step in the worst sections, probing through the ice crust that had formed over 3 days of compacting, testing the ground before committing his weight to it. He moved steadily, not fast. Urgency in deep snow was how men died in deep snow. He moved with the careful economy of a man who has learned to manage his resources in conditions that will outlast any burst of effort he can produce. The ranch house emerged gradually. First the roof peak, then the chimney, then the dark mass of the walls buried to the windowsills in drifted snow. No smoke from the chimney. He hacked through the packed drift at the front door with the mattock and forced the door inward against the frozen threshold ridge with his shoulder. Cold air rolled out. The deep cold of a space that had been without meaningful heat for the better part of 3 days. The kind of cold that has settled into the walls themselves and cannot be addressed with a single fire, but must be pushed back gradually, degree by degree over hours. The fireplace held coals buried deep in gray ash. Almost nothing. One dining chair had been broken apart for fuel. Part of a cabinet lay beside the hearth. Frost spread across the interior walls in the corners. Aldous Crane was in the chair nearest the fireplace. He had his coat on over 2 sweaters and a wool blanket across his legs. He was awake and alert. which was the first thing Caleb checked, but diminished the particular diminishment of a large, strong man who has been cold for a long time and has spent most of what he had simply staying alive through the nights. Mabel was in the rear room under every blanket in the house. She was breathing. Caleb built the fire the way he built all fires, now small and deliberate, feeding it with the patience of a man who knows that the goal is not to create the biggest possible flame, but to produce steady heat for as long as the fuel will allow. He heated water. He brought it to Mabel first, then to Aldous. Aldous held the tin cup in both hands and looked at Caleb over the rim of it. "The cave held," he said. It was not a question. He had already understood the answer before Caleb arrived. The answer was visible in Caleb's face in the fact that he was here and vertical and moving through the snow with sufficient strength to hack through a frozen drift. A man whose shelter had failed would not look like that. It held. Caleb said. Aldous looked at the fire Caleb had built, at its size, at the way it was feeding controlled efficient, nothing wasted. "I kept the fire too large," he said slowly. "The first 2 days. I thought larger meant safer, and I burned through the wood faster than I should have." He paused. By the 3rd day, there was not enough left to choose between large and long. Caleb said nothing. Aldous looked at him. "The stone in your cave," he said. "It holds the heat even when the fire is small." "That's what it does," Caleb said. "Yes." Aldous was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to say something to you." He said it flatly, without preamble, in the voice of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has decided, sitting in a cold chair in a house his fire couldn't save, that the time for holding it has passed. "The winter, Nora died," he said. "Your cabin roof was nailed wrong along the north ridge. It had been leaking since August, and the wet had gotten into the wall framing on the east side." He stopped. "I knew. I rode past that cabin in September, and I could see it from the road." Caleb sat down in the chair across from him. "I had cedar in the kitch store and a roll of tin sheeting that would have sealed that roof for 10 years, Aldous said. He looked at his hands around the tin cup. "Nora asked me in October. She came to the store herself and she asked me." He paused. "We were in the boundary dispute about the eastern pasture, and I was angry, not at her, at you, and at the situation, and at the fact that she had married you instead of someone who could build a roof that held." He stopped again. "I told her no." The fire crackled once in the hearth. "She died in February," Caleb said. "She died in February," Aldous said. "And I have been angry at you for 7 years because being angry at you was easier than being what I actually was." He set the tin cup down carefully on the arm of the chair, which was wrong, and a man who let his sister die in a cold house because of a property dispute. He did not say he was sorry. He was not built for the architecture of apology in the way that required the specific words. But what he said was, the bones of it, the structure under the thing, the weight of it, admitted without flinching, set down on the table between them where it could be seen clearly for the first time. Caleb sat with this for a long moment. He sat with the fact that the roof could have been fixed, that Nora need not have died in that cold room, that the last words she had spoken to him, the words about the floor, the words about wood not holding warmth, had been spoken in a house that a cedar board and a roll of tin sheeting could have made survivable, and that the man across from him had possessed both and chosen not to give them. He sat with all of this. Then he said, "Mabel needs to get warm. The fire here won't do enough today. The walls have been cold too long." Aldous looked at him. "We need to get her up to the cave," Caleb said. "Both of you. Can she walk?" Aldous looked toward the rear room. "She can walk," he said quietly. She always was stronger than she let on. "Then let's go," Caleb said. He stood. He gave them an hour with the fire first. Let the immediate area of the hearth climb back towards something livable. Let Mabel dress in the warmest things she owned, and let Aldous fill a canvas sack with what they would need. Then they went out into the white world and began the climb back up the mountain. The climb was hard. Aldous' legs had stiffened in the cold, and the deep snow required a lifting step that was exhausting for a man in his condition. Mabel moved with the focused determination of someone who has decided that difficulty is a fact to be managed rather than a reason to stop. She did not ask yet for help until the last steep section of the trail where the snow had drifted thigh-deep and the footing beneath it was uncertain. Caleb went ahead with the mattock. Ledger was at the cave entrance with the lantern. He had heard them on the trail below and had the light up and the outer barrier partially opened before they reached the top. He stood in the entrance holding the lantern at shoulder height, serious and steady, illuminating the last section of the path. When Mabel reached the throat wall entrance and felt the warmth come out to meet her, that dry, stable heat that the basalt had been storing and giving back for weeks, she stopped. She put one hand on the timber frame of the entrance and stood in the warmth for a moment with her eyes closed. Then she stepped inside. Aldous came through the entrance behind her and stopped in the same place. He stood in the threshold of the throat wall and looked at the chamber, the cedar shelf, the drying line, the water buckets that had not frozen, the fire small and steady and sufficient, the basalt bench along the eastern wall radiating the warmth of weeks of careful fires with the patient indifference of stone that does not know it is doing something remarkable. He walked to the bench. He sat down on it. He placed both palms flat against the stone on either side of him and held them there. He looked at the fire. He did not speak for a long time. Copper crossed the chamber and sat beside him. The old dog looked up at Aldous Crane with calm, accepting eye, no memory of the morning on the hillside in October. No ledger of cold looks and contemptuous voices, and a child told to leave. Just a dog sitting beside a man who was sitting on warm stone and needed the company of a creature that was not keeping score. Aldous looked down at the dog, then at Ledger, who was standing near the fire pit watching the visitors. "How long has this bench been warm?" he asked the boy. Ledger considered the question with the seriousness he gave to all questions that deserved it. Since Pa fixed the thermal mass in the floor, he said, "About 3 weeks steady now." Aldous looked at the stone under his palms. 3 weeks, he said quietly. "Yes, sir," Ledger said. Aldous nodded slowly. He looked at Caleb, then across the chamber. He looked at him without the armor of contempt, without the performance of authority, without the version of events that had required Caleb to be a failure, so that Aldous could be something other than what he was. Just one man looking at another man across everything that had happened, and everything that had been admitted, and everything that could not be undone, but had at least been named. Caleb looked back. That was sufficient. That was perhaps all that was available to either of them. It was enough. The territorial inspector arrived on the 6th day after the storm broke. His name was Harlan Price. A compact, careful man in his mid-40s who had ridden up from the valley on a borrowed horse because his own had thrown a shoe in the post-storm mud. He arrived at the cave entrance with the expression of a man who has made a long, uncomfortable journey to perform a duty whose outcome he has already determined internally. He had Dorcas Pell's letter in his coat pocket. He had a second supporting letter obtained during the storm from a valley resident named Cutter, who ran the feed yard, a man whose signature Dorcas had secured. Caleb suspected during the period when Cutter was entirely dependent on her winter credit for his family's supply. Harlan Price stepped inside the cave entrance. He stopped. The warmth reached him before anything else did. That dry, stable heat in a basalt cave in late November in Montana Territory, a thing that should not exist and unmistakably did. He stood in the throat wall passage, and his expression went through a series of small adjustments that he did not entirely manage to control. Then he saw the chamber, the cedar sleeping shelf, the drying line with socks and a wool shirt hanging in the warmth, the water buckets full and unfrozen, the fire small and steady, the basalt bench along the eastern wall, and on the bench, Aldous Crane and Mabel Crane sitting side by side. Aldous with his coat off because the cave was warm enough that he did not need it. Mabel with a cup of heated broth that Ledger had made for her that morning, holding it in both hands. Aldous looked at the inspector without standing. "Harlan Price," he said. "I know your family. Your father ran cattle south of Helena in the 40s. Price looked at him carefully. Mr. Crane, he said, I didn't expect to find you here. I expect you didn't, Aldous said. A pause in which several things that did not need to be said aloud were nonetheless communicated clearly. This cave, Price said. He looked at the chamber again, at all of it, taking inventory. This is where the child has been living. This is where we all lived through the White Divide storm, Aldous said. My wife and I included. Our ranch house failed on the second day. Caleb Hearn's cave did not fail at any point during the storm. He paused. I want that stated clearly for whatever record you're keeping. Price looked at Ledger sitting on the cedar shelf with Copper beside him. The boy was warm and looking at the territorial inspector with the same steady reading attention he brought to everything. He did not look like a child in danger. He did not look like a child who needed rescuing from the situation he was in. He looked like a child who was home. Pastor Orrin Falk stepped forward from the rear of the chamber where he had positioned himself an hour earlier, as though he had understood this moment was coming and had arranged himself accordingly. He held out a folder of papers. I believe you'll find, Falk said, that the supporting complaint contains a procedural deficiency under the 1859 Montana Territorial Settlement Act. The original letter carries one witnessed signature. The second letter you are carrying was obtained under circumstances that raise questions about the voluntary nature of the consent. He paused. I have documented both concerns in the materials here, along with a formal statement from Mr. Aldous Crane regarding the fitness of this dwelling as a place of safety for a minor child in his care. Price took the folder. He looked at it. He looked at Aldous Crane sitting on the warm bench without his coat in late November. He looked at the unfrozen water. He looked at the dry clothes on the line. He looked at Ledger Hearn, 8 years old, warm and present and undamaged by the worst storm the basin had seen in a decade. He closed the folder and put it in his coat pocket alongside Dorcas Pell's letter. Observation complete, he said. His voice was level and professionally neutral. The dwelling presents no observable condition of danger to the child. He looked at Caleb. I'll file the assessment in Helena before the month is out. He put his hat on. Case closed, he said. He walked out of the cave into the cold mountain air and rode back down the valley trail toward Clearwater Crossing. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Mabel Crane, without looking up from her broth, said quietly, Nora always was the smartest one in that family. Aldous looked at his wife. You never told me that, he said. I told Nora. Mabel said. She looked up. She looked at Caleb steadily with the direct gaze of a woman who has been quiet for a long time and has decided that some things need to be said before more time passes. She knew it too, Mabel said. She always knew. The weeks that followed the White Divide storm had a different quality to them than anything that had preceded it. The valley below was changed not in any structural way, not in any way that could be mapped or measured, but in the way that places are changed when something has happened in them that everyone present will carry and none of them will entirely be able to explain. Dorcas Pell did not climb the mountain, but the price of lamp oil returned to its previous level without explanation or ceremony, which was as close to a retraction as Caleb expected and more than he had been certain would come. Winslow Red came up on the 7th day after the storm broke. He arrived with a bundle of split cedar on a hand sled and stood outside the throat wall entrance as though uncertain whether the welcome he needed to walk through still existed after 6 weeks of absence. He stood there for a moment in the cold. Caleb stepped aside. Winslow came in and stacked the cedar against the rear wall and stood in the warmth. He did not speak about the weeks he had not come. He asked whether there was fence work on the lower slope that needed doing. He said he had 2 days free before the Crane Ranch winter schedule resumed. There's always fence work, Caleb said. They worked through the afternoon without discussing anything that had happened between October and December. The work was the discussion. The showing up was the apology, and the showing up was accepted without ceremony, which was the only kind of acceptance available between men in a hard country. Pastor Falk brought supplies every week through December. He never made ceremony of it. He set the things inside the entrance, exchanged a few words, and left. On his fourth visit, he paused at the basalt bench on his way out and pressed his hand against it. "Still warm," he said. "Always," Ledger said from the cedar shelf. Falk looked at the boy for a moment, then at Caleb. Something moved in his face that was quiet and complete, the expression of a man who has been watching something unfold and has arrived at the point where it has become what it was always going to be. He left without saying anything more because nothing more needed to be said. Aldous Crane came up every Sunday. He never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes rope, sometimes beeswax for the timber joints, once a small iron kettle better suited to the cave's fire management than the one Caleb had been using. He never explained what he brought or why he had chosen it. He simply brought things that were useful and set them down and spent an hour in the cave and left. He and Caleb did not revisit what Aldous had said in the cold ranch house about the roof and the cedar and the tin sheeting and the decision made in anger during a pasture boundary dispute. What had been said had been said. It sat in the record between them, acknowledged and permanent, and neither of them saw any reason to disturb it further. The acknowledgement had been made. The record would stand. That was enough for men who had both lived long enough to know the difference between what could be undone and what could only be carried forward. Once in the middle of December, Aldous sat on the basalt bench and watched Ledger explain unprompted the relationship between the river stones in the floor and the temperature stability of the cave through the night hours. The boy used his hands the way he always used them when explaining something he understood from the inside, pressing his palm against the bench to demonstrate the stone's temperature, then holding it above the bench to show the air temperature above it, making the invisible visible through the body's simple capacity to feel. Aldous listened to all of it without interrupting. When Ledger finished, he looked at the boy for a long moment. "Your mother would have understood that immediately," he said. Ledger looked at him. "I know," he said. "Pa told me she already did." Aldous looked at Caleb then. Not with the complicated expression he had worn in October, not with anything that required reading. Just looked, one man to another, across everything. Caleb looked back. It was the last time the distance between them felt like distance. Gable Voss came down from his shelter once more before the deep cold of January sealed the upper trails. He arrived without announcement, as he always arrived, and stood at the cave entrance in the thin December light. He looked at the throat wall construction, the vent shaft reinforcements, the secondary baffle in the corner, the drying line, the unfrozen water, the cedar sleeping shelf. He stood there for a long time. Then he said to the cave itself, perhaps, or to the mountain behind it, or to the grandson he had lost in 1857, whose death had purchased whatever knowledge he had been able to pass on to a man who needed it. It holds. He turned and walked back down the trail. That was the last time Caleb saw him walk. In the first week of the spring thaw, when meltwater was running cold and fast beneath the eastern rocks and the snow was pulling back from the lower slopes in long grey retreats, Caleb found Gable Voss in his low stone shelter, with his hands folded on his chest and his eyes closed and the particular stillness of a man who has finished. He buried him on a high basalt slope facing east. He chose the spot because of the vent ridges visible from it, the same ridges Gable had come to study when the weather was changing, reading the mountain's intentions from the patterns of moving air. He set a simple marker, cedar crossbeam on a basalt upright. No inscription. The mountain remembered what needed remembering. Pastor Falk said a few words. The wind carried most of them away before they landed anywhere. That seemed right. Gable Voss had not been a man who required a ceremony. He had required accuracy and patience and the willingness to ask the right questions rather than assuming the answers were already possessed. He had found in Caleb Hearn someone worth the cost of sharing what he knew. In sharing it, he had also given it again to the grandson, who had not been old enough to survive the price of the first attempt to share it. The knowledge had not died with the boy. It had waited for the next pair of hands. The basalt slope held the warmth of the morning sun for 4 hours after the sun moved off it. Gable would have noted that, filed it, moved on. Years passed the way years pass in mountain country, marked not by calendars, but by the character of successive winters, by what held and what the weather took, and what got built to replace what was lost. The cave remained. In the first years, it served only Caleb and Ledger. Then, travelers crossing the divide in sudden weather began finding it. Ranch hands caught in early blizzards learned where the eastern shelter stood on the Clearwater slope. Freight teams, pushed off schedule by sudden storms, arrived at the throat wall half-frozen and left 2 days later with their lives. Families in their first season of settlement, not yet knowing that Montana weather honored no one's schedule, came through the entrance and felt the warmth of the basalt bench and understood in their bodies, before they understood it in their minds, that the man who had built this place had known something about stone that most men did not. By the late 1860s, the cave no longer carried Caleb's name in the way it once had. The valley called it the Clearwater Shelter. That shift of language from a man's cave to a place's name meant that it had stopped being something one person had built and had become something the community had absorbed into its own understanding of itself and its survival. Things that begin as one man's desperate solution sometimes become given time and weather and the accumulated endorsement of people whose lives they have saved a community's inheritance. This was perhaps what Gable Voss had meant by things waiting for the right hands to understand them. They did not remain that man's things. They became the place's things. Ledger Hearn grew into a quiet man with his father's hands and his mother's way of pressing his palm against surfaces to read what they were holding. He became a stone builder, not through apprenticeship or formal training, but through the accumulated understanding of a childhood spent in a basalt cave, working out why stone held warmth and timber did not, and what the difference meant for the people who lived inside each. He built in the way a man builds when he understands the material from the inside, not following rules about what stone could do, but asking it what it knew and then listening to the answer and then building accordingly. He understood thermal mass before he fully understood arithmetic. He knew airflow before he could read a surveying document. He had learned from the evidence of his own body through the winters of his childhood that the difference between a place that held heat and a place that bled it was not about how hard you fought the cold, but about how well you understood what you were working with and what it was willing to do. He carried this into every stone structure he built in the Clearwater Basin across the decades that followed. Aldous Crane died in the spring of 1874. He had been climbing the mountain every Sunday for 12 years by then, had not missed a Sunday in all that time except when injury made the trail genuinely impassable, and had never once arrived empty-handed. The things he brought were always useful and always practical and never accompanied by explanations, which was the language available to him for what he was trying to say, and was received in the spirit in which it was offered. Mabel lived another 12 years after the White Divide storm. Caleb attended her funeral with Ledger at his side, and Aldous' people shook his hand, without awkwardness, which meant something. It meant that the story the family told itself about what had happened had been revised, and that the revision had been accepted, and that Caleb Hearn's place in the family's accounting was no longer in the liability column. One evening in October, an October that came early with the same bite in the wind off the eastern ridges that the October of 1861 had carried the same yellow grass on the lower slopes, making its annual declaration about what was coming. Caleb Hearn sat outside the cave entrance on the flat basalt shelf he had cleared and leveled in the second year. He was not a young man anymore. The work of those early winters had settled into his body the way hard work does not, as damage exactly, but as permanent presence. The wrist bent wrong in the forge accident, the knuckles that read the cold before anything else did, the particular set of his shoulders from 10,000 repetitions of hauling rope up a mountain grade. Below him, Clearwater Basin lay in the thin, late afternoon light. The settlement at its center was larger now. More buildings, a wider road, the evidence of 2 decades of people arriving and deciding to stay. The Crane Ranch was still there, operated now by Aldous' nephew, a practical young man who had grown up hearing the story of the White Divide storm and knew exactly what the Clearwater Shelter was and what it had done. From inside the cave he could hear Ledger's voice. His son was explaining something to a boy from the valley below, the son of a family that had settled the eastern section of the basin in the past decade, too young to have any memory of the winter of 1861, knowing the cave only as the Clearwater shelter, knowing it as the place that stayed warm when everything else failed. Ledger was explaining draft flow. Caleb could hear the patience in his son's voice, the same quality Gable Voss had carried, that way of asking questions rather than delivering answers, of understanding that knowledge has to be found rather than given if it is going to take root and stay. "The mountain breathes," Ledger said. "You just have to let it." He said it the way Gable had said it 20 years ago on a cold bitterroot slope. The same words, or close enough that the difference did not matter. Knowledge, passing from one pair of hands to the next, carried forward by people who had understood it well enough to pass it on, worn smooth by use, kept alive by being used. Caleb listened to his son's voice from inside the cave. He looked out over the basin. The wind came off the eastern ridge and moved through the dry grass of the lower slope with that sound like running water, cold and clean and carrying the smell of the high places it had come from. The smell of stone and distance, and everything that remained after the weather had done what weather does. He pressed his palm flat against the basalt shelf beside him. The stone was warm. It had been absorbing the afternoon sun since morning, and it would hold that warmth for hours, yet long after the light was gone, long after the air temperature dropped toward freezing, patient and steady and certain, doing what stone does when you give it time and heat and do not ask it to be something other than what it is. He kept his hand there. Nora had pressed her palm against a timber wall and felt the cold coming through and known there was something that held warmth better, and she had said basalt, and she had been dismissed, and she had died before she saw that she was right. But she had said it to him in her last breath, and he had heard it even though he had not understood it yet, and he had carried it up a mountain in October of 1861 and built it into stone, and it had held. The warmth moved through his palm and into his hand and up through his arm, the way warmth always moved through things that were willing to hold it. His wife had known this. His son was teaching it. The mountain had always known it, and would continue knowing it long after all of them were gone, patient and indifferent and warm in the places where the sun had touched it and the stone had done. What stone does? Absorbing what it was given, holding what it absorbed, releasing it slowly and steadily into whatever dark came next. The mountain held its warmth. It always had.